But first, the breaking news out of Turkey. At least 10 people were killed and more than 20 injured by terrorist attacks today at Istanbul's main airport. Details still coming out. It's very early at this point. We don't know that much. But Turkish officials say the attack involved 2 suicide bombers. Mark, I know you were struck, as I was the other day. The LA Times ran kind of an incredible piece that talked about 858 attacks around the world in the month of April. Even with my bad math, that's more than one a day. Is this the new normal? And if it's the new normal, what does it mean for our politics, broadly speaking, and for this presidential campaign?
Turkey is obviously just one of the biggest hot spots, and I've been in that airport, and the security just seems to me to be underwhelming. And obviously this could be domestic, could be international, but this is, I think, based on the pace of attacks, based on the instability around the world, based on groups' desires to influence American elections and use that platform, I think this is going to be a persistent issue, and I think both candidates are going to step up and have to talk about it. You look at the traits questions, the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, and both of them, both Clinton and Trump, can argue that the country likes them more to handle these kinds of issues.
Have very different approaches to it. It's also, I believe, the 2-year anniversary of when ISIS declared a caliphate in the Middle East. So this is not, although we are getting used to these kind of attacks, this is also one that has some particular kind of meaning. Joining us now from Ankara, Turkey, for the latest reporting on this incident is Bloomberg correspondent Onur Ant. Onur, why don't you give us a sense of what you know at this moment? I said before we don't know that much, but give us a sense of what's happening on the ground.
Well, about 2 hours ago, we were notified about an explosion or a slew of explosions at Istanbul's main international airport, the Atatürk Airport. Soon after the first report, it emerged that there were 2 explosions that took place at the airport. The initial details suggest that 2 suicide bombers, they were spotted by police at somewhere near the security checkpoint. First, they opened fire at people around them using Kalashnikovs, or at least one of them did, and then they blew themselves up. Now, the details about exactly how many suicide bombers were there and how many explosions took place is still not clear. There are conflicting reports from the Interior Ministry and the Minister of Justice himself, but it's clear that at least 1 or 2 explosions took place. At least 10 people got killed and more than 60 got wounded.
Onur, can you just give us a sense of, that airport obviously is a big international airport, and there's obviously a lot of traffic through there all the time. It seems like this incident took place in the evening. It's obviously past midnight your time there now. Just at this time of year and that time of night, how busy is that airport?
Well, normally this is Turkey's biggest airport, the most. It's really crowded all the time. May is a very busy time of the year normally. Obviously this year, because of previous attacks by Islamic State militants and as well as separatist Kurdish militants, both in Istanbul and in other Turkish cities, there has been a huge drop in the number of foreign tourists visiting Turkey. Just today we found out that the number of foreign tourist arrivals in May declined by more than 30% year on year. That's the biggest drop that we have ever had, according to data that span about a decade. So it's not as it wasn't as busy as it always was. Not tonight, not this month, but still, it's a busy time of the year, busy time of the day. There are quite a few people. There are a few reports, videos out there, unconfirmed, but looks quite genuine. Of the explosion from security cameras, it looks pretty bad.
Okay, Onur Ant in Turkey, thank you very much for that. Mark, let's just come back to this conversation a little bit. I think, one of the things that has been clear for a while is that we have different kinds of presidential elections. This one has been shaping up for a while to be a security-focused election. I think you made the right point a minute ago. Both Trump and Clinton, I think, are very confident that not only that they have an idea about how to deal with these matters on the world stage. Their confidence is obvious, but they also think they're playing a politically winning hand, right? They both think, each of them thinks that they have the Trump card, so to speak, on this issue. I try to cast my mind forward. If these incidents are happening with this kind of frequency, and from what we know in the polling and what your kind of fingertip feel is, where do you think the public will be if these kind of incidents play out with regularity between now and November?
I think Donald Trump's case on these issues is the broadest case is the same as on the economy, which is, do you like the way things are going? Hillary Clinton was part of some decisions, including involving Libya, which clearly can be argued led to more instability in the world based on the old elites. You know, when Trump is asked, you know, why aren't you have support from people like Brent Scowcroft? He's like, do I want the support of the people who got us into all these troubles around the world? Same on the economy, same on changing Washington. Trump's arguing for change over experience. Clinton on these issues will argue for experience.
And that he just does not know enough about the world, and that he's, you know, not just unsuited temperamentally, but also intellectually.
Risky and untested, she'll say over and over. Okay, after 2 years and $7 million, Republicans on the House Benghazi Committee today finally released their report. Had a few new details about the 2012 attack in Libya that killed the U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. The 800-page document includes a strong rebuke of the U.S. agencies that Republicans say were more concerned with politics than the safety of American diplomats. But the findings turned up no new bombshells about the then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who Democrats insist was all along the primary target and reason for this very extended Republican-led inquiry. And yet, during a Capitol Hill press conference today unveiling the report, the chairman of the committee, Congressman Trey Gowdy of South Carolina, dodged all the questions he got about the presumptive Democratic nominee.
The resolution doesn't mention Secretary Clinton. Speaker Boehner nor Speaker Ryan have ever asked me to do anything about 2016 presidential politics. If you, at the end of reading that report, can conclude that it is about one person instead of about 4 people, I will be shocked. If you read the report, you will see their report mentions her name far more times than our report does. I don't think you'll see any of that in the report. Is it in the report?
But he's promoting it right now.
And you know what? You're going to write a story about your takeaway from the report. I stand on our report. How my fellow citizens, including my committee members, read the report, how you read the report, what story you do on the report. You read the report. You will not see any of those quotes in the report.
There are bumper stickers and T-shirts all over this country that say Hillary Clinton lied, people died. Is that true?
You don't see that T-shirt on me, and you've never seen that bumper sticker on any of my vehicles, and you've never heard me comment on that.
All right, so everybody in this drama seems to be playing their parts. You just saw the chairman deny he has any partisan motivations. He said that all along.
100 witness interviews.
Other Republicans in the House and members of the committee spent all day filleting Clinton, including for her handling of the initial attack and security. And in true Clinton classic style, Hillary Clinton reacted to the report at a campaign stop in Denver this afternoon by calling it an old story, a partisan witch hunt, and a waste of taxpayer money.
I understand that after more than 2 years and $7 million spent by the Benghazi Committee out of taxpayer funds, it had to today report it had found nothing to contradict the conclusions of the Independent Accountability Board or the conclusions of the prior multiple earlier investigations carried out on a bipartisan basis in the Congress. I'll leave it to others to characterize this report, but I think it's pretty clear it's time to move on.
Man, John, the entire process of this, from Kevin McCarthy's famous comment about how this was politics, to the way the hearing went when she testified, to the report itself, where there's a minority report that goes after her big time, even though Trey Gowdy's main report doesn't. Republicans could not have played more into Hillary Clinton's hands and her campaign's hands on the thematics of how do you investigate a Clinton.
Right.
So my question is, does this report, with some new facts, is it so underwhelming? Does it end the aspiration of Republicans to try to use Benghazi to hurt Hillary Clinton's chances?
As you know, I have believed that aspiration has been kaput for a while, certainly as far back as when she testified in October and pretty much stuffed the committee into a basket and sent them off on a river someplace. I think this is now finished for in any meaningful way for any voter who's not yet decided in this election. There are a lot of Republicans who will always believe Hillary Clinton was guilty of some conspiracy, although the Gowdy report makes it pretty clear that she wasn't. They'll always believe that, and you'll be able to whip up some of them. But none of those people were ever in play for her. They're not in the middle of the electorate. I think it's dead. I think it's done. I think it's finished. And look, not surprisingly, given the number of investigations that were before this investigation, that this investigation basically has shown those investigations were all pretty much on the money.
Every time I travel around the country, almost without fail, I hear from Republicans who say, Benghazi, that's the silver bullet. That's isn't that the issue? I think the email controversy is a bigger problem for her today after this report. And I have to say, I've been watching Republicans investigate Clintons since Arkansas. This was the most inept. You can do a serious investigation. You can have in the back of your mind partisan leanings and still fact find, oversight, seriousness. The confidence that Speaker Boehner and other Republicans showed in Trey Gowdy was highly misplaced. He's a nice man. I'm sure he was a fine prosecutor, but he was in over his head by 1,000,000 miles.
Totally, and you saw that. We both talked about it. You saw that at the committee hearings. That's why the hearings to me were so decisive, because that was such a big moment for her. She finally went, and they were ill-prepared. They were off the reservation. There was a horror show, and so this just didn't surprise me that this would be still a mess, because that was such a big public moment. Always was going to be a bigger public moment than the report, because it was on television, and they screwed that up. I couldn't figure out why this would not end up being a damp squib, which is what it is.
Most anticlimactic ending since the Driver's Ed episode of the Brady Bunch. Just ridiculous. All right.
I love those. Those analogies sometimes are really incredible.
When we come back, what does Texas Senator Ted Cruz have up his sleeve for the Republican convention in July in Cleveland? And is anything the campaign of Donald Trump can do about it? We'll be right back. On a day when the U.S. Commerce Department announced the weakest GDP growth in a year, the presidential race was framed by two broad and competing visions about economic growth in America. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump both presented plans today for creating more jobs at home, and their messages could not have been at more polar opposite ends. Let's start with Trump. The presumptive Republican nominee spoke at an aluminum factory in Monessen, Pennsylvania, where his speech, titled Declaring American Economic Independence, leaned on some familiar protectionist themes from Trump's past He called for the nation's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. He said he'd direct officials to identify and police trade agreement violations all over the world. He also said he would renegotiate NAFTA, of which he's been a frequent critic, and label China a currency manipulator. He had other proposals, all of which he said would protect American workers.
As Bernie Sanders said, Hillary Clinton voted for virtually every trade agreement that has cost the workers of this country millions of jobs. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the greatest danger yet. Ask Hillary if she's willing to withdraw from the TPP her first day in office and unconditionally rule out its passage in any form. Under a Trump presidency, the American worker will finally have a president who will protect them and fight for them. It will be American steel that will fortify America's crumbling bridges, American steel. It will be American hands that remake this country, and it will be American energy mined from American resources that powers this country.
Now, contrast what Mr. Trump had to say with Hillary Clinton's remarks today at a tech startup incubator in Denver. She unveiled the newly suited to a new digital interconnected global economy.
I want America to get back in the future business. You know, saying that you want to make America great again is code for saying we want to go back to the way it used to be. We don't go back, we go forward. But we got to go forward with intelligence and a real sense of purpose. Today, I am releasing a comprehensive plan to keep America on the cutting edge of technology and innovation. We're going to let young people who want to start something new defer your federal student loan payments for up to 3 years. We have to make sure every student in America, no matter what zip code that student lives in, gets the chance to learn computer science before they graduate from high school. I intend to make sure we do what we did with electricity and, you know, my grandparents' generation. We connect every home and business in America to high-speed internet, and we do it on as fast a time scale as possible.
In addition to investing in tech incubators, expanding access to capital for startups, and defending net neutrality, Clinton's plan calls for high-speed internet in every household by 2020 and $10 billion in federal funding for computer science and STEM education. It would reform immigration visa laws to help recruit highly educated job creators from overseas and offer student loan deferments for entrepreneurs and forgive student loans for people who start socially conscious businesses in disadvantaged communities. Mark, classic WADR question. Who's got the better case here in terms of politics and policy?
Well, there's no doubt that some of the things Trump proposed are out of step with the Republican Party, and under classical economic theory would not be good ideas. I do think there's a bipartisan consensus in this country to get tougher on China in some way, and that the playing field needs to be leveled. We've never had a presidential candidate in the modern era win who wasn't a free trader. Let's break for a minute, though, and go to Brussels, where British Prime Minister David Cameron, speaking at the EU summit. Let's listen in.
They can often be long and frustrating and difficult, but when I've attended these councils, I've always remembered that this is an organisation and this is a formula that have brought together countries that not that many years ago were in conflict. And in spite of all the frustrations, I've always found it very reassuring that we found a way to talk and to work together and to resolve our differences in dialogue and in argument. And so as I leave the European Council, probably for the last time, I pay tribute to all of the presidents and prime ministers and everyone who works here who've made these meetings as successful as they have been. Tonight obviously was an important meeting. It's the first time that the European Council have met since the British people's an important meeting. It's the first time that the European Council have met since the British people voted to leave the European Union. And there was universal respect for this decision, and this decision will be carried through in Britain and is understood that it will be carried through here in the European Union. But of course the tone of the meeting was one of sadness and regret. Our partners in the European Union are genuinely sad that we are planning to leave this organisation, and that was very much the tone of the discussions at the dinner tonight. But they were very constructive discussions, they were very positive, they were very calm, they were very understanding that Britain should seek, and Europe should seek, the closest possible relations as Britain leaves the EU, close relations over trade, over cooperation, over security. While Britain is leaving the European Union, it will not, it should not, and in my view it won't turn its back on Europe. In many ways, I wish that people at home had been able to hear some of the discussion we had at dinner tonight. The countries, our partners, our friends, our allies, talking about the values that we share, the history that we share, and the things that Britain has brought to Europe. The Estonian Prime Minister talking about how the Royal Navy helped to secure the independence of his country 100 years ago. The Czech Prime Minister talking about how Britain had been a home for Czechs fleeing persecution in their own country in 1948, in 1968. Those countries of Eastern and Central Europe that feel such a debt to Britain for standing by them when they were suffering under communism and for supporting them as they joined the European Union. The French President talking about the visit that we'll be making later this week to the battlefields of the Somme, where British and French soldiers fought and died together for the freedom of our continent and for democracy and the values that we share. As I say, it was the Maltese Prime Minister talking about the extraordinary history between our countries. The Irish Prime Minister pointing out that between the 11th century and for centuries to follow, England and Ireland had been in conflict, but recently, and he said now, our relationship had never been closer, and that what a good partner we had been to them, both inside the European Union and today. So, as I say, a positive, constructive, calm, purposeful meeting about how we should now take forward this agenda of Britain leaving the European Union, but wanting to have, I think rightly, the closest possible relationship that we can in future. There was a lot of reassurance that until Britain leaves, Britain is a full paying member of this organisation and so is entitled to all of the benefits of membership and full participation until the point at which we leave. I think there were some very important messages tonight. Obviously, messages that the economic problems and challenges that we face in Britain are also problems and challenges that are going to be faced in the rest of Europe. A very important message that while we seek the best possible partnership that we can after leaving the European Union, it is impossible to have all of the benefits of membership without some of the costs of membership. And that's something the next British government is going to have to think through very carefully. And also, while I think what you might have read and seen about a clamour for Britain to trigger Article 50 without delay, that was not the mood of the meeting. That was not what a clear majority of my colleagues and partners said. But of course, everybody wants to see a clear model appear in terms of what Britain thinks is right for its future relationship with Europe. That is work that I can start as Prime Minister today with the new unit that we're setting up in Whitehall. We can examine all the different options and possibilities in a neutral way and look at the costs and the benefits, but it will be for the next British Prime Minister to determine, the next British Cabinet to determine exactly the right approach to take and the right outcome to negotiate. And that decision to trigger Article 50 will be for the next British Prime Minister and the next Cabinet, I would suspect, after they've made that decision about the outcome they want to pursue. As I said earlier today,
is British Prime Minister David Cameron addressing what is a dominant issue now, not just in the United Kingdom, but all over England. We're going to have the latest for you on Turkey and the terrorist action there, the presidential race here in the U.S., and more right after this.
changed yesterday. This got ever steeper. Are the markets ahead of the Fed or are they behind?
It's not risk on, risk off on the markets, but where investors are a little bit more sophisticated.
From San Francisco and Silicon Valley, we're covering the story that's changing everything.
Connecting everyone in the world is one of the great challenges of our generation.
Talking to the people today, you'll be talking about tomorrow.
Internet is going to change China.
And tackling the tech industry's biggest debates.
We're starting to see catastrophic events.
We have companies that are growing fast. We don't tell them to pull back.
Disruption creates opportunity.
Innovation, technology, the future of business. Bloomberg West, weekdays on Bloomberg Television.
From New York, Bloomberg 1130. To Boston, Bloomberg 1294.5 FM HD2. And now, San Francisco, Bloomberg 960 and 103.7 FM HD2. Across the country, Sirius XM 119. And around the world, the Bloomberg Radio Plus, TuneIn, and iHeartRadio apps. On air, online, and on your smartphone, Bloomberg Radio is where you are.
What does Silicon Valley get that other industries don't yet?
Bloomberg's Emily Chang sits down with the biggest influencers in technology and media.
Honestly, in the beginning, we were not trying to make money.
It was all an experiment. You think that you may live to 120?
I certainly hope to, yes. I'm a little paranoid of not being needed and wanted, I guess.
For candid conversations about how they made it and where they're going next, Studio 1.0, Thursdays at 8:30 on Bloomberg Television.
With all due respect, that guy could never get elected president.
He's got a chance to win.
He makes Joe Biden look like a guy in control of his mouth. Welcome back. There are now reports that the death count from the terror attacks in Turkey have risen to at least 28 people killed, more than 60 are injured. Officials now believe there were 3 suicide bombers. We're going to be following this story and more when we come back in a little bit.
Welcome back. On a very busy news day, we're calling in some top shelf help to have us break down the dueling economic speeches we heard today from the 2 presumptive nominees. Joining us now from Washington, NBC News political director and the host of Meet the Press and Meet the Press Daily, Chuck Todd. Chuck, I want to start with trade. take out, you can't control for the variables, but take out the identities of the Democratic nominee, the Republican nominee, just the notion of a presidential candidate, major party nominee running as a protectionist, is that on balance better or worse if you're trying to win 270 electoral votes?
You know, I would have said it would have been worse. I wouldn't have. This feels like a throwback of the 70s and the politics of the 70s and 80s that frankly didn't work back then. Protectionist, you know, the Democrats at that time were the party of protectionism. Just think back to Walter Mondale. And, you know, the reason the Democratic Party eventually turned to a Bill Clinton, they were looking for a free trading, pro-business Democrat because they thought they couldn't win. So it is sort of we are in a new period, I think, of how Americans view trade deals. Obviously, of what's going on, the way Americans feel about the way the economy and way globalization works for them, or frankly hasn't worked for them. But it's even more stunning to me to see the Republican nominee be so anti-free trade, and to have groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and National Association of Manufacturers, two big pro-business, pro-free trade, Republican-leaning organizations having to trash the Republican nominee.
So, Chuck, what struck you most about Trump's speech today? I was certainly struck by how much he seemed to lift rhetorically from the Brexit Leave campaign.
Sure.
You noted that, I'm sure, but what else struck you?
Well, I just think it's, you know, this is the one issue that he's never wavered on. So he has more credibility rhetorically on this issue, and that's what you could sort of, he owns this in a way he doesn't own other issues. Because if you go back, the first time this guy jumped into politics, right, and to criticize an administration was in the 80s, and it was over Japan. Bad deals, bad trade deals for America. So I feel like of all issues that he's taken a position on, this is the one where he's most consistent, and you can tell that this one, there's some genuineness behind it if you've followed him over the decades.
Hillary Clinton obviously felt pressured by Bernie Sanders in the nomination fight to be more skeptical of free trade. Do you think that she will draw a line on this against Trump, or will she try to basically go with what has been, as you pointed out, winning in presidential politics, which is more of the free trader?
You know, I think she's totally conflicted on this, and I think that you're going to see a very cautious, you know, when in doubt, when she's conflicted about where the public is, or when any Clinton is conflicted about that, there's certainly very much a cautiousness there. I just don't know how she credibly comes across as sort of an anti-trade nominee at this point. I think the brand name of Clinton doesn't stand for that. The brand name of Obama doesn't stand for that. And so
Bernie Sanders would agree with you.
Yeah, and I think this is a real challenge for her. She does not want this fall campaign to be about trade deals. Yeah. Let me just put it that way.
Right. Well, you know, Chuck, today she went out and gave a speech where she basically said, look, this is going to be about the past versus the future. That's pretty familiar turf for a Clinton, right? She said, you know, Donald Trump wants to take us to the past. I'm going to talk about technology and innovation. I'm going to take us to the future. That's what Bill Clinton did in 1996, too, when he tried to build that bridge to the 21st century. So is that the out? Is that the way she gets out of this conundrum, by trying to pitch herself as an avatar of the future?
Yeah, and I think also try to make Trump just personally a throwback and just not capable of this. But I'll tell you, this gets at the heart of sort of like what is the big idea of a President Clinton? What is she going to do? What is she going to tackle? And, you know, she doesn't have that big economic idea that supporters can wrap their arms around, that feel as if, okay, you know, for better or for worse, Trump is basically saying, hey, I'm going to just throw away every trade deal that's ever happened. He doesn't want to say trade war per se, I think, but he's basically saying, yeah, so what if we start a trade war with China? We got to shake things up. What is she going to have in there on the economy, a big idea that she owns that she'll tackle in her first 100 days? And, you know, right now it's a lot of incremental policy proposals she's putting out there. It doesn't feel like she has that big thing that these frustrated middle-class, working-class voters can wrap their arms around. I think she's got to come up with something by the fall.
Yeah. So that takes us to the traits in the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, where she's leading, but she is behind him on a number of traits, including better on the economy. I'm wondering, obviously her lack of definition is part of that. But do you think, on balance, voters are familiar with Trump's prescriptions and favor those? Or they just like the fact that he's a businessman? Why is he beating her on that?
I think he's got the businessman halo effect. I mean, I've heard this from many a consultant over the years, is that it takes a long time, it takes a lot of work to chip away at a voter perception that somebody who's been successful in business isn't the one that's best prepared to manage the economy. Yeah. And it takes a long time to chip away at that. Even though Trump himself arguably has chipped away at his persona sometimes. I think that's part of it. But I think the other part of it is the poll showed she still has trust issues. You know what's amazing about our NBC Wall Street Journal poll is that this is among the worst polls Hillary Clinton's ever had. Except because it's in comparison to Trump, it looks like a good poll for her. But if you extrapolate, if you take out the head-to-head, there's not a good number in here for her. Right. I'm trying to find it. There's not one.
So, Chuck, I want to shift and talk about the Benghazi committee reports today. It has seemed to me for a long time like Benghazi, at least since last October when she testified, like the Benghazi has been a dead issue except for hardcore Republican conservative partisans.
Right.
As of today, can we officially say, given what's in this report, that politically this is no longer a problem for her, or are there still some landmines, again, with actually movable voters in the electorate, not with generating outrage among far-right conservatives?
Well, let's separate the two issues. Benghazi, the conspiracy theory, dead. Okay, the idea that somehow there was purposeful actions made or not made around a failed rescue attempt of Ambassador Stevens or things like that. I think that door is shut. What's not shut for her is mismanagement of the Middle East. Is the whole why was Benghazi unsafe? Well, the initial Libyan policy in the first place. So that's where there's still vulnerability for her. Whether Trump's capable of taking advantage of that, I don't know. But I can tell you this, the Republicans didn't help themselves today when they have to put out two reports, right? Trey Gowdy puts out a report, and then like, no, he wasn't partisan enough. We're going to put out a separate report, Jim Jordan and Mike Pompeo, that just trashes Clinton, but we're going to separate it out. I think it only presents a Republican Party that just wasn't satisfied with its own conclusion.
And is that because the Speaker of the House basically let, as he often does, the chair handle it, and Trey Gowdy was not up to the task of doing this from the politics of it? Or,
well, that's an interesting theory. I don't know. I mean, I thought Trey Gowdy was more than capable of handling this. I think what I'm trying to figure out is why did this offshoot, why was it allowed to happen? Why wasn't it done? Maybe it's perhaps Jim Jordan is somebody that a lot of leadership is always nervous about. Right. He sort of straddles the fence between the establishment and the Freedom Caucus and those folks. I don't know what it was, but it strikes me as it undermined their own report. I think when you're not speaking with one voice, then you might as well not be selling anything at all.
Chuck, we had this incident in Turkey, in Istanbul. At this hour, we don't know that much, but do you have any sense of the politics of that at this early stage?
I wouldn't. It's just, there's no more important and challenging country for any president to deal with than Turkey. And the challenges that Turkey faces, their own domestic terrorism issues, plus ISIS, plus Syria, sometimes it's no wonder that this isn't a weekly occurrence, that we're in Turkey wondering about a terrorist attempt.
Yep. Terror almost every day somewhere around the world. Chuck Todd from Washington. Chuck, thanks a lot. Coming up, more right after this.
Republican officials today unveiled the set design for next month's Republican convention in Cleveland. Joining us now from our nation's capital to talk about how things might go down in that fine city, former Republican Party Chairman Mike Duncan. Also with us from D.C., Democratic strategist Peggy Lee, the former executive director of the Democratic Governors Association. I believe someone who worked at the DNC for a while. Chairman Duncan, let me start with you. What do you think at this moment, on the basis of your finely honed political instincts and your understanding of the rules, what do you think the likelihood is that there could be something that would significantly disrupt the preferred flow of the Republican convention on the part of the Trump campaign?
Well, the preferred flow will be disrupted. I don't think there's any question about that. That's why we're having the business session in 2 parts on Monday. So you're going to see all of the sausage made then. You'll have the Credentials Committee. And by the way, we only had 5 contests compared to 21 contests in 2012. You'll have the Rules Committee. You'll have the Platform Committee and Permanent Organization. So we'll get most of those things out of the way. And then the next big moment will be when we call the roll and nominate people for president and vice president.
Peggy, what do you think about the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia? Everyone has expected for a long time the Republican convention to be chaotic, the Democratic convention to be peaceful. It seems like there might be a chance for some kind of chaos in Philadelphia. What's your thought about that?
Well, it wouldn't be unusual. I mean, we saw that even in 2008. You know, we did have some of the very, very loyal Hillary Clinton supporters hold out until the very end, until the vote was on the floor. But I think, you know, it's going to be interesting going forward. And I think you're starting to see what, you know, Elizabeth Warren and other progressives that are coming in really starting to unite and get behind Hillary Clinton. And so I think that's going to alleviate some of that tension that might be out there. But, you know, it's still Bernie. Bernie's still, you know, still running. So we're waiting to see.
Penny first and then Chairman Duncan. Do you all think that having a good convention is still vitally important, or given that they're back-to-back, given we're in a different age of social media, it doesn't really matter as much as it used to?
I still think it has an impact. I mean, people are going to be able to tune in, and sometimes for the very first time, and starting to see kind of what the choreography of it is, and how Mrs. Clinton would relate, how she is presented, what her speech is going to be. So I do think that it does affect some people, but this is also a race in which both of the candidates are very, very well known, and so there's not a lot of second guessing that is out there. But it's still important, the choreography, and what you're also watching for is to make sure there's not a gaffe, that there's not a mistake, something that can be blown up on social media more than you want it to and take you off your message.
Mr. Chairman?
My number one goal for John McCain in 2012 was to give him a bump coming out of the convention, and we did that. That's because there are 4 times that people really are paying attention. 1, when you consolidate the nomination. 2, when you're at the convention and you're defining yourself at the convention. Number 3 is the debates. Those are critical, and they'll be more critical this time. And the 4th is your organization. It's get out the vote during the voting season.
Mr. Chairman, are you going to be going to the convention in Cleveland?
Oh, absolutely. This is my 12th convention, 10th as a delegate.
Right.
I've made plans.
So there are a lot of your fellow Republicans who are big players in the party who are not going to be in Cleveland for one reason or another. How big a problem is it for Donald Trump that, for instance, the governor of the home state in Ohio may not show up at the convention, that John McCain won't be there, that the Bushes won't be there, that Mitt Romney won't be there? How big a problem is that for Donald Trump?
I really don't think it's a problem because as a political operative over the years, I've advised candidates not to go to the convention. Your choice is to stand on the stage on Monday and give a 2-minute speech, or you can be back in your district working. And in many instances, they need to be back in their districts working. So I don't see that as a problem. The party's coming together. You're seeing it in the polling numbers. We're coalescing. And you're going to see it on Thursday night when the nominee stands before the convention and gives his view and vision for America.
Mr. Chairman, let me just stick with you because I understand that you said you've given the advice to candidates to stay in their districts because it'd be better for them. That's kind of not really the question I'm asking. I'm asking whether for Mr. Trump it's a problem that the past 4 Republican presidents and presidential nominees, like basically no one who's been nominated, maybe Bob Dole will be there, but pretty much all of them are staying home, as are a lot of others. Is that not an optics problem that the leadership of the party is kind of boycotting the convention?
Well, I think not. I think in Trump's instance, because he's such a non-traditional candidate, he's the businessman candidate, that it doesn't matter as much as it would for others rallying around. In fact, in some instances, it would be better for Trump if the establishment boycotted him. He benefits from being the outsider. People want change in this election. You're seeing it in Europe. You're seeing it around the world. You're going to see it in the United States.
Penny, is there a degree to which you all are watching the Republican convention in your party and thinking Trump is a showman, this could be a huge, incredibly impressive convention, or you're betting on a first-time candidate not pulling it all together?
Well, you never want to root against somebody. You always want to make sure that your candidate is well prepared and doing what they need to do proactively. But absolutely, we will be watching this convention. I mean, look, this has been a completely untraditional campaign to date. And whether it be, being conducted in 141 characters on Twitter, you are going to see a dynamic platform or a dynamic convention, and one that can go either way. Is he going to stay scripted? Is he going to go just start, tearing into his own fellow Republicans for not showing up? Is he going to be, all these different kind of, personalities in which could take over? So it is going to be fascinating. It is going to be interesting to watch. This is something that is in his control. It is a highly scripted event if he wants it to be. And so that is what everybody is going to be seeing, whether or not the scripted Donald Trump and the person who has pivoted, or is this going to be the off-the-cuff, uncontrollable Donald Trump
Mike,
that many of the American people find unsavory.
Mike Duncan, we plan to have a pretty extended discussion with you about some of the dynamics and rules of your convention, but the breaking news, the Terrorist Act, and Turkey has interfered with that. But I want to close by asking you about one aspect of that, which is, if you were Paul Manafort and the other high command in the Trump side, what are your biggest worries about minimizing the disruptions, the biggest unknowns?
You've got to make sure that people understand what the game is and what the goals are. I think Paul's gone a long way. He's got a good team in place that are going to be on the floor helping to whip. The uncontrollable is the timing of the convention. You've got to make sure that you hit the marks. I don't know what kind of marks Trump wants. I don't know if he wants an hour of prime time or he thinks it should be 3 hours. I don't know who he wants as the main speakers each night. Those are the kinds of things that you think about if you're putting the program together now.
Penny, just how big a deal will this be for Hillary Clinton? She's a very well-known figure among most Americans. Almost everybody has an opinion, but her speech is going to matter. So what does she have to do in that speech, and how important is that?
I think she needs to continue to not only reassure the American people that she has a vision for how the country should be led forward, but she also needs to be human, and she also needs to show her own, personality and express empathy. I think some of the tone in which she has been criticized for is that there is a distance and a disconnect between her and the American people, so that she needs to show compassion, she needs to show empathy. But I also think in this day, when you have a contrast with Republicans, she needs to show a competency and a steadiness when you have a Republican candidate who has been as reckless as he has and careless with his words and quick to react. I think her steadiness is actually going to be a strength in that convention.
Okay, Mike Duncan, Penny Lee, thank you both for coming on. Coming up, we'll talk more about the news out of Turkey today, and we'll be right back.
close tonight. Joining us to talk more about the horrible terrorist attack today in Turkey, Bülent Alireza, director of the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Thank you for joining us. Put in perspective, this is a country that has had many terrorist attacks. Put in perspective the size of this and the significance of it being at that important international airport.
Well, it's the height of the tourist season. Millions of tourists come to Turkey. Many of them come through Istanbul Airport. And the fact that this occurred at the terminal, just at the entrance of the terminal, apparently 3 attackers were involved. The suspicion falls on ISIS. Is about the worst thing imaginable when Turkey has been actually suffering from the kind of problems that it's had.
Mr. Alireza, just give us a sense of the various, there's a lot of speculation going around about what the political motivations here are. Turkey and Israel just come back together after a period of estrangement. There's Syria. Just give us a sense of what the potential causes of this or motivations might be for this particular attack.
Well, you know, Turkey's location always makes it vulnerable to the kind of terrorism that it's been suffering through, particularly during the past year. There's an ongoing civil war in Syria. There's fighting with ISIS in Iraq. It's a bad neighborhood to be in. Turkey's finally made up, or at least moving towards making up with Israel, and has also reached out to Russia to solve to deal with the tensions with that country. But nonetheless, having to deal with the war against the PKK, as it has been for the past 30 years, plus to deal with the seepage of ISIS terrorism from south of the border in Syria into Turkey itself, just makes the job of managing the country and managing foreign relations very difficult. And Chuck is absolutely right. I mean, this is a problem for whoever the next president is going to be, and I don't think he was exaggerating.
If this is an ISIS attack, based on what you've seen so far and your understanding of the country, is this likely to bring Turkey together or to cause domestic strife as people argue about what to do about such things?
Well, it's obviously going to be a rallying around the flag effect. But look, Turkey suffered more than any other country from the Syrian civil war. There are over 3 million Syrian refugees, and the country has cost Turkey billions and billions of dollars to look after them. Many of the tourists have tried to get into Europe from Turkey, which has created problems with the Europeans. And many of the people who are fighting in Syria have actually found their way into Europe to carry out terrorist attacks, and unfairly Turkey's been blamed for this. So look, this issue of ISIS terrorism is obviously going to go on as long as there is the Syrian civil war next door.
All right, Bülent Alireza, thank you very much. Bloomberg will be covering this story all evening long. Mark and I will be right back.
As we go off the air, we're still tracking all the details on the suicide attacks in Turkey today at the airport. The death toll now is reported to be 28 people dead at the Istanbul airport, 60 people injured. BloombergPolitics.com, Bloomberg Television will be covering all the latest on this terrible attack in Turkey all evening long. Coming up now, though, on Bloomberg West, Emily Chang talks to investor and entrepreneur Mark Cuban. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow right here. Sayonara.